All right, buckle up for a deep dive into a real mystery today.
Okay.
We're looking into Jarvis Catoe, an
Hmm.
American serial killer, sometimes called the DC Strangler.
Right.
And the thing is, we don't even know how many victims he had.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to look at his Wikipedia entry,
Okay.
some old newspaper
Oh,
articles,
yeah.
try to get a handle on all that.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah, it's a really,
Yeah.
it's a case that makes you wonder, right?
Definitely makes you think about how someone can just snap like that.
Yeah. Yeah, like,
I mean, born in South Carolina in 1904,
right.
eldest of 8 kids, preacher for a father.
Normal upbringing, you'd think.
Yeah, wouldn't think that lead down this road.
No, not at all.
But
But then in the sources,
yeah.
there's this big shift in his behavior right around 1925.
1925, yep, serious head injury. It's like everything changes.
It's like a switch flipped or
It
something.
really does make you think about those brain injuries.
Yeah.
How they can affect someone, even cause
Yeah.
violence.
It's a whole field of study, they say.
It is, absolutely, the link between trauma and crime.
So that head injury, could that be what started him down this path?
It's possible. Definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
And after that injury, his actions. There's a pattern there.
Oh, yeah.
Public indecency arrests, all those traffic violations.
Like a build-up almost?
Yeah, like he was working his way up to something worse.
To something much darker. Yeah.
Exactly. And it all leads to his, well, his MO?
Right. His modus operandi, how he did it.
The handyman part of the story.
That's a truly scary thought.
Yeah.
Reading his confession, he actually says he pretended to be a handyman
Oh,
to get into his victims' homes.
just awful. You think you're letting someone in to fix something,
Right, to help you.
and it's a trap, a total betrayal.
It makes you wonder how many people might have just let him in.
Unknowingly, yeah, with no idea of the danger.
Haunting thought.
It is. And then there's the DC connection, even more questions there.
1929, he moves to D.C. to live with his brother. Maybe a bigger city made him feel like he could get away with more.
Could be. That anonymity, blending in, it's a pattern with some killers.
Using the city to their advantage.
Exactly.
So we've got the head injury. Maybe that's the start of it all.
Yeah, possibly.
And then his crimes, like he's getting worse, more violent.
Escalating. Yeah.
And then this horrifying MO using being a handyman to target people.
Ugh, it's disturbing. Really gets to the heart of what makes this case so unsettling.
Yeah.
Not just random, but calculated, predatory. And then when you think about when this all happened,
Oh, right. Back then, things were different.
very different. Yeah, forensics, not what it is today.
Like DNA and all that.
Exactly. We're spoiled now. But in the 30s and 40s,
They didn't have all those tools.
nope. Imagine trying to solve these cases with fingerprints just starting.
Right. No DNA profiling, no fancy analysis.
Makes you wonder how many they couldn't solve, how many connections were missed.
Because of those limitations, yeah.
It's a thought that comes up with a lot of these older cases, and it brings us to, well, to the victims.
Catoe's victims.
Right. At least 8 murders we know of between 1935 and 1941, mostly women.
And the way they talked about it back then, sex slangs, it's just,
Oof, I know that term.
it's a reminder of how differently we see things now.
Absolutely. That term, it put the blame on the women, their morality, not on the killer.
Like it was their fault somehow.
Exactly. And it shows how much language and attitudes have changed.
But also how we need to look at these old cases carefully.
With a critical eye, definitely. And then there's how Catoe was caught and what happened after.
Okay, so 1941, they finally catch him.
Right. Years of these awful crimes, and then boom, apprehended.
And then everything happens so fast, right?
It did. Prosecuted, convicted, sentenced to death, all really quickly.
Makes you think, why so fast?
Yeah, we talked about the limited forensics, but they still got a death sentence.
What was their evidence? How did they convince the jury?
Well, confessions were a big thing back then. But also, think about the context.
Okay.
Capital punishment. It was much more common, more accepted.
And racial bias, we can't forget about that.
Definitely not. Catoe was black in a segregated society.
So even though he was caught and executed, there's still so much more to it.
Oh, yeah. Layers of complexity about justice, about bias, about how things really worked back then.
Which brings us back to how many victims were there, really?
We have the confirmed cases, but those old newspaper articles, they hint at more.
More victims.
Possibly. And that's where things get tricky, ethically speaking.
Because we could be talking about people whose stories were never told.
Exactly. Lives lost. Maybe even forgotten. It's a tough thing to think about.
It's like we only have part of the picture, you know?
Yeah, like a puzzle with missing pieces.
We know about Catoe, his victims, how he did it.
Right. We had the frame of the story.
But then there are those gaps. Those could be more victims.
People whose stories we don't know, maybe never will.
Lives lost but never really acknowledged. It's heavy stuff.
It really is. It makes you think, what do we do with this incomplete picture?
How can we approach it responsibly?
I mean, first we have to admit it's incomplete, right?
Acknowledge those gaps.
Especially with crimes against, well, marginalized communities.
The historical record, it's not always the whole story.
Nope, not always accurate either. We have to be careful with the information we have.
So for everyone listening, what does this mean for us? How do we look at this case and others like it the right way?
I think it starts with context.
Okay, context.
We can't just look at Catoe's crimes on their own. Got to think about what it was like back then.
Socially, politically, all of that.
Exactly. The racial dynamics, what law enforcement could do, how people thought about crime and punishment,
Things were so different.
and even who they believed, whose disappearance mattered enough to investigate.
You're right. Those are tough things to think about, but we have to really understand the past.
And maybe by doing that, we learn something about today, too.
So why should we care about a serial killer from so long ago?
Because his story is connected to us now. It shows how justice isn't always fair, how things like power and prejudice affect what we think happened in the past.
Makes us question things, keep investigating, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. We've got links to all the sources we use for this deep dive.
Yeah, check them out.
Do some digging yourself, see what you think, and as you're reading, ask yourself, what's missing here? Whose voices aren't we hearing? And how can we make sure those voices are heard even now, all these years later?
That's a good question. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a journey for sure.
It has. Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.